Give you both options?
It does.
Okay, yeah. So you are the main host now. So you can record it on your computer.
All right, everyone. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here. And those who want to join us a little late are, of course, more than welcome to. My name is Rebecca Trout, and I am the director of the All-America City Award Program at the National Civic League. I'd like to welcome you to our May All-America City Promising Practices webinar, Lead by Stepping Back, Empowering Community Assets. A little bit about the National Civic League before we dive into the meat of today's webinar. We are a 125-year-old nonprofit, and we aim to advance civic engagement in order to create equitable and thriving communities. The All-America City Award is what we are primarily known for. It began back in 1949 to recognize exceptional civic engagement in local governments. Each year, we recognize 10 communities for their inclusive civic engagement work that is fostering improvements in communities. This year's theme is recognizing those who are using civic engagement to foster health and well-being in local communities. You can actually learn more about this year's finalists on our website, and we will be hosting our 2020 All-America City Awards in August. So while the All-America City Awards celebrates local accomplishments, we use these monthly webinars to share innovative practices, initiatives, and projects from around the country to a wider audience. Today, I'm excited that we will be hearing from John McKnight, one of the co-founders of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute, and Dan Duncan, the current board president and the ABC of the ABCD Institute, as well as a longtime faculty member. They'll be discussing the principles and tools of ABCD and will provide real-life examples of residents who have taken on new responsibilities and functions and how they've developed new ways to join local governments as co-producers. A little bit of housekeeping before we begin. I have muted everyone with the exception of our presenters. So I ask that you remain muted and to cut back on any background noise. If you do have any questions during the presentation, please submit them via the chat box and we'll have the presenters address those at the end of the webinar. And without further ado, John and Dan, the floor is yours.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Rebecca. It is a pleasure to be here with you. And I wanted to make sure you're recording it.
Yes, I am. Thank you for the reminder.
Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone to this webinar. Again, I'm Dan Duncan, the senior consultant at Clear Impact, faculty member of the Institute, and the current board chair of the Institute. And I've used RBA in my work. I spent about 30 years as a United Way professional, worked with a lot of a lot of cities and counties and communities around this work together. And so we're going to tell some good stories, I think, and information around it. And John, do you want to say hello to everyone?
Welcome, everyone. Look forward to being with a group so large. I hear there are 200 people maybe joining us. So this is going to be a wonderful bash.
All right. So what I'm going to do is spend a little bit of time talking about what ABCD is about, Asset-Based Community Development. And then John's going to talk about some ways that you can, in fact, use this effectively in your work. So why community engagement? Why co-production? A story I tell to help build this is really why we need everyone's gifts. If we think of our work that we do as cities, as counties, as community as professionals, as nonprofits, whoever that may be, it's hard work. So if we think of it as a marathon race, that's a long race. It's 26.2 miles, 44.4 kilometers. It's a long race. And if it's set up so that the only people running the race are the professionals. And I want to highlight a couple of people seem to still have their phones not on mute. So if folks could all mute their phones so we can deal with some of the background noise, I apologize. All right, and so if we think of this as a long race with the only people running the race, the professionals, the people that work at the city, work at the counties, work in the nonprofits, and the community is at the finish line waiting for the professionals to come across the finish line to solve their problems, to save them, the community is waiting a long time because the professionals, not enough of them can get across the finish line. They take a wrong turn, they run out of energy, they lose a grant, something happens along the way. So we have to purposely turn this race into a relay race, where the professionals can pass the baton to the community to do those things that they can do, and we pass it back to the professionals to do those things that only they can do. If we do that together and have everyone running in the race, we have a much better chance of getting across the finish line to create the kind of communities that we want to live in and raise our families and do well in. So community engagement and co-production through the power of asset-based community development. ABCD, that term was coined by John McKnight and Jody Kretzmann, based on some research they did a number of years ago that led to their book, Building Communities from the Inside Out. But it was their analysis that most people were just talking about the needs, what's wrong. There must be another lens, a lens of looking at what's right, what's working, and what can be used effectively to build stronger communities. Because it's the capacity of local people and their associations that build powerful communities by focusing on what we already have. So ABCD starts with a different set of questions. Instead of what do you need, what can you contribute? Instead of what do we need, what can we do with what we already have to get what we need? How can we build on that and build on our resources? And based on their research, they found that the low-income communities, that the low-income neighborhoods and communities they visited, that those were doing better were asking these questions first and not waiting for people from the outside to solve their problems for them. So based on that, just to give you a quick overview of ABCD, I call these the ABCD principles of three: the characteristics, the role of residents, the three questions, and asset mapping. So the principles: asset-based, locally focused, relationship-driven. So asset-based, based on John and Jody and their research team's research, they identified these 6 key assets that were being used effectively in communities that were focusing on their gifts and their assets. The first one, the individual's talents and skills, those individual skills, their education, what people knew about. And we call that the gifts of the hand, head, and heart. The gifts of the hand are the practical skills that people have: gardening, cleaning, how to fix a car, how to fix a bike, those skills that people have. Gifts of the head are the things they know about, their knowledge, child development, healthcare issues, the history of the neighborhood, how to run a meeting, whatever that may be. And the gifts of their heart, their passions, those activities that drive them and stir them to action. Also, the local associations. Associations are where people come together voluntarily because of their passion. The largest example of associations are people where they go to pray, because the church, the synagogue, the mosque may be an institution, but the congregation is an association. And we all know there's power in relationships that can be used effectively, building on those associations. Also, the local institutions, but what they found, the local institutions, businesses, government, and nonprofits, in the stronger communities, they were what we call leading by stepping back and supporting the neighborhood. So the businesses were investing in the neighborhood, making sure that they were hiring people from the neighborhood. The government and nonprofit were leading by stepping back to create partnerships, to create that relay race for that effective work. The third ingredient was the environment, the land, the property, the vacant lot for the community garden, the abandoned building for a meeting room, whatever that may be. So using that effectively. And then the fifth ingredient, the economic strengths, the economy, whether that's bartering, sharing people's gifts and abilities, or actually organizing the buying power of the community to make sure that they get the produce at the store that they want, and those kinds of things. And finally, what ties it all together are the culture and stories, because that's what builds the relationships that are so important to share people's gifts and activities. Just a quick story. When we moved to our current community, was the moving van was unloading the information, unloading our things. Our neighbors next door came over, introduced themselves, and said, "Looks like you don't have a ladder." That's good because I have the ladder for the neighborhoods. I've got 3 ladders. They're hanging on the wall of my house outside. If you ever need a ladder, you don't need to ask, just come and get it. So that was a way for them to introduce themselves to us and begin to share their gifts. Locally focused, neighborhood focus. Why that is so important of looking at one neighborhood at a time? For a couple reasons. First of all, it's where families and their children live, and they have the greatest potential to thrive if they're engaged and connected in their neighborhood. It's where the action is, the good and the bad. The more we can build on the good action and create that, the bad goes down. To help kids succeed, they do better in strong families, and families do better in supportive communities. But probably the most important reason for place-based strategies, neighborhood strategies, is simplifies engagement. If I wanted to be involved and engaged, but I had to drive across town or get on a bus or a subway to get to where I'm going to volunteer, I'm not going to do it very often. But if I just have to go out my door and go 2 doors down, 2 streets over, I'll find a way to get engaged in what I could help share in our community. The important part of this, though, the evidence-based part, the research clearly says that social capital and collective efficacy make a difference. Social capital is the number of positive relationships that people have in their lives. The more positive relationships people have, the more connections they have, they tend to be healthier, wealthier, and wiser. So it makes a huge difference. There's a lot of clear research saying that social capital has a huge impact on longevity and health. We know the story of an elderly couple. If they pass away, if one of the couple passes away and the other stays isolated, doesn't have those connections in the neighborhood, they typically very quickly die of a broken heart very quickly because of that lack of connection. Collective efficacy is the belief in the ability to come together and share things and build things and do things by working together using their gifts. The more you can build on the social capital and the collective efficacy in a neighborhood, the stronger that and healthier that neighborhood is going to be. Because effective communities look inside first to solve problems. They don't wait for the outsiders to solve them for them. Relationships are seen as power. They have a good sense of their assets and capacities, not just their needs. Leaders open doors. Citizens are involved. And what we mean by citizens are people in the community that are sharing their gifts and are building relationships, regardless of their papers. And people take responsibility for making a difference in their community. The second principle is the 3 questions, the 3 strategic questions that help us as institutions lead by stepping back. Be very clear, what can residents do by themselves for themselves? They don't need us to do them. They can do them themselves if we just give them a chance. What can residents do with a little help from institutions? Where do we partner together to be effective? And what do residents need done that they can't do themselves? What are those things that institutions do need to do? Provide the police, provide the roads, the street lights, all of those kinds of things the institutions have to do, but the connections can come from the community. And so just quick examples of what individuals can do creating health. According to the World Health Organization and county health rankings, here are the 5 determinants of health. Personal behavior and social relationships are the first 2, the most important. Physical environment is important because if somebody lives next to toxic waste, they might have some healthcare issues. Unfortunately, there is an inverse correlation between health outcomes and economic status because we don't have always have people don't have the funding to always meet what they need around health. But the least important, the one that's only worth in the county health rankings, 20%, is access to health care. So if we want to create health, you can see there is a clear role people have in personal relationships, social relationships, personal behavior, again, exercising, eating right, all of those kinds of things. So the community has a role. Crime and safety. The police often come too late. Story I'd like to tell you, I was doing this training, this woman came up to me afterwards and said, "You're right. You know, I came home one night, everything was gone from my house, everything, including my dog." She called the police, they came too late. They went next door and interviewed her neighbor and said, "Did you see anything suspicious?" And he said, no, I didn't see anything suspicious. I've never met her, so I didn't know her. So I assumed she was moving. So if they would have had a relationship, if they would have been connected, chances are he would have known she wasn't moving, and he could have done something before it was too late. So block watch programs, neighborhood watch programs do make a difference. And finally, raising kids to be effective, particularly with currently what we're going on, where these days these percentages have even changed. But it really, before COVID, before schools were closed, kids only spent 15% of the year in the classroom. They spent 85% of their time in their community, in their neighborhood, in their house, connecting with people. So the community has a role to educate and help build powerful, connected kids. The third principle is the role of residents. And I like to highlight, there are a number of key roles, but I like to highlight 3 of them today. First one, there are times people need to be recipients of service. They need to be a client, a patient, a student. But in that case, they are dependent on a professional, and they have to be let into that group, if you will. But once they're in that as a client, patient, or student, it is a dependent relationship. The professional knows what's best, and the professional makes all the decisions. That is important. If I break my leg, I want to go to a doctor. I want the doctor to set my leg and be in charge. But if I want to learn about nutrition, there may be somebody in my neighborhood that knows more about nutrition than my doctor does. Excuse me. The second role is that of an advisor. So at least we ask people, what do you need and how would you like it delivered? But that typically just drives institutional action. It's better institutional action because they've selected and received input, but it's still institutional action. And many organizations, many communities think that is where community engagement stops, is with advising. But there is a third role, and that is a role of a producer, a co-producer of their own and their community's well-being. In that case, we ask a new question. Again, what can you contribute? And then our role becomes helping to remove barriers so people can become part of the solution and contribute what they can. So if we're going to, again, help kids learn to read, we could create a learning group in the community, in the neighborhood to help do that. There's a whole host of things that people can do as producers of this work. And to do that, to identify people's role as co-producers, we need a process to do that. And there's one process called asset mapping. And asset mapping is about discovering everyone's gifts and passions, so we can find out what gifts, what skills, abilities people have. When we talk about gifts, we talk about gifts of the hand, head, and heart. Gifts of the head, gifts of the hand, practical skills people have. Gifts of the head, things they have knowledge about, and their passion, what they care about, what drives them to action, what would get them up at 7 a.m. on a Saturday morning to go do something. So we discover those gifts. We then need to ask people to share their gifts, to get involved based on their passions, because we've become kind of a stand back society, if you will. You know, we used to have barn raising to build communities. Now people step back. So we have to ask people to get involved, but we ask them to get involved and do something around their passions, what drives them to action. And then the most powerful thing we can do is connect people with the same passion to act collectively. So we find the people that care about hunger and they want to start the community garden. So the people that have that passion and have the skills create the community garden. So if you're interested in a toolkit of asset mapping, here's a toolkit you can download from our website, an asset mapping toolkit I've developed. But we have to be clear about asset mapping. It's a strategy to identify the assets that are available from within the community, people themselves. It must be done by the residents themselves that call the neighborhood home. It can't be done by the outsiders. And it's a process for connecting, engaging the community to build on their assets and their gifts. It's not just another list of agencies or programs or services, but it's a process for connecting to be effective. We have a great example of a community doing that process in the Abundant Community in Edmonton, Canada. That's doing an amazing job of identifying at every neighborhood that they can a way to connect people, and one block at a time to build those relationships to be effective. Have another interesting story that connects back to communities and cities. Jay and David are two pastors of a church in a city outside of Denver, Colorado. And they got a new mayor. And so they organized 17 churches. And they went to the new mayor and said, Mayor, we've organized these churches. What do you want us to do? And what they thought he would say was, well, I'd like you to do programs for kids, you to do programs for seniors, and you three to do programs for families. Because that's how we often think that solutions come about, is from programs. And that's not always the case. So in this case, the mayor was pretty smart. He said, your churches, I want you to do one thing and one thing only. And that's help people be better neighbors. If you could just do that, that would make all the difference in the world. And they kind of said, oh my gosh, oh my God, love thy neighbor as thyself. So they developed a website and this book on the art of neighboring about how churches can help people become better neighbors. And how do you engage people to share their gifts and become involved? One of the things you can do, and the most important thing, is focus on the gifts of their heart, because that's their motivation to act. What we do is we have volunteers, and we create volunteers, and often volunteers are actually recruited to do my to-do list. An institution or the city or somebody identifies 5 things we think can be done by volunteers. Then we recruit people to do those 5 tasks, which are our to-do list. And then we try to figure out, then we spend all our time after the first meeting they come to figuring out how do we motivate them to get them to show up again, because we didn't focus on the gifts of their heart. So what we want to do is find out what people care about and ask them to do things, and then just get out of the way. Because if it focuses on the gifts of their heart, their passions, they'll show up more than once. So to help do that, the kind of the new role of how do we begin to do this, how do we become precipitators and stimulators of this work, is a couple ways to do that really be very clear that part of our key role, the strongest, most powerful role we can do, is removing barriers so people can become part of the solution, so that they can have time and have an opportunity to engage and do things. So to do that, we really, as institutions, need to think about this opportunity to lead by stepping back. And Rich Harwood from the Harwood Institute has a very nice quote about that, which is, avoid the pull inward and the danger of allowing programs and professionalization to crowd out the community. So how do we create that space? So one of the ways we can do it is taking these 3 questions that I talked about earlier. What can people do by themselves for themselves? They don't need us to do them, but often we are doing those things. What can they do with a little help from us? Where can we partner together? And what do they need done that they can't do that we have to do? Is add 2 new questions to this. Let's look at all of the things we're currently doing, and what could we stop doing to create space for that resident action. So if there's some things we're doing, let's stop doing them. And what can we offer to the community beyond the services to deliver, services we deliver to support that? So how do we do some organizing? How do we do some acting? How do we do those things? And I'm going to tell one quick story and then turn it over to John to kind of wrap us up with some questions and some ideas. But I was working with a organization, and this organization was setting up a new neighborhood center in this community. And as they were setting this up, I was at the meeting. They were planning for their grand opening ceremony. And they were talking about what caterer they wanted to hire to come into that neighborhood with the food for this event. And I kind of said, time out. I bet there are people in the neighborhood where you're putting this neighborhood center that know how to throw parties. I bet there's some really good party throwers in that neighborhood. And there's probably some people that really know how to cook. So if you are really interested in supporting this neighborhood and building strong partnerships with the neighborhood, you shouldn't invest in a caterer that's not located in the neighborhood, so the money flows out of the neighborhood. What you should do is begin to build relationships by having conversations with people in the neighborhood to find out who throws the best parties, who are the best cooks, and then invest in them to do not the grand opening ceremony, but to have the neighborhood actually put on an event, a party to welcome you, the institution, to the neighborhood. So that's a quick example of how they can do that. And they did that, and they built much stronger and better relationships with the people in the neighborhood. So at this point, I don't know if we want to see if there's a couple questions in the chat box, and then I'll turn it over to John. The main question is, yes, you'll be getting the PowerPoint. You'll be getting actually the recording of the link to the recording of this as well. And any other questions? Well, I will kind of watch the chat box for questions as I turn it over to John McKnight.
Well, thanks, Dan, and Rebecca as well. I think that we said at the beginning, at least in the title of this event, that we were going to think about the future and whether there are new ways to move as we move through and hopefully past the current crisis. And what would those new ways be? So let me start by reminding us all of something that has happened in the last couple of decades over and over again. And that is that institutional leaders have begun to recognize the limits of what they can do. And part of that is because they don't have the kind of budgets they'd like. But there's a much more significant reason, and that reason is that they have reached the limits of the capacity of their organization to do what they purport to do. There is some limit to that tool. And you see it all the time. If you listen to a police chief these days of a big city, the chief will say, well, you know, we've trained our people well. We have a good management system. We have good technology. And the way we explain that crime rates don't seem to be going down is that we're doing our job. In fact, we're doing about all we can. But the truth of the matter is that the community really isn't involved. And until they get involved, we've reached our limits. The same thing is you hear from people in medicine who are in the public health field. They say, you know, we've done almost all we can in terms of really affecting morbidity or mortality with medicine. But as Dan showed earlier, the main determinants of whether you're going to be healthy are 4 factors that are community control or could be community control. And educators say the same thing. They say, well, you know, we're getting better and better, more and more professional. But a lot of our schools, we recognize they aren't doing well. And the problem is the community. It's the community these kids come from and the experiences in the community. So what we're talking about is a new era. And it's an era in which institutional leaders are doing a good job, could use some more money, I'm sure. But the real issue is they've reached the limits of what they can do. And they also recognize that unless something different happens in the community, then things aren't really good change. Now, it's interesting to think, why has this happened? Why have these institutions gotten to their limits? And I think the reason is because they have come to take on functions that they can't perform, where they're not the right party to deal with the function. One example of that, and incidentally, let me say that you will be getting an email from Rebecca with all of the supporting documents that go with information I'm providing. So if you have a lot more interest in detail and technique, you'll receive, I think, 4 documents you can download and 2 that you can order. They're very inexpensive. At any rate, when we get to the place where we recognize that our limits institutionally have been reached, the question is, how do we then get the community to be involved in doing its functions? And as you'll see in one of the publications that Rebecca will send you, there's a scholar named Jerry Vollmer who wrote a book called Schools Can't Do It All. And he went back to 1900 and began to look at school curricula and school budgets. What were schools doing? And he identified by decade new functions that were mostly community functions that the school had taken on. And you'll see in the document what those functions are. And there are 85 of them, 85 functions schools have taken on since 1900 that used to be, by and large, community functions. Now, the consequence of that is that the communities aren't doing their job in terms of raising their children, and the schools are overburdened with things they can't do, so that it's a double loser. The communities have become impotent in terms of raising their children, and the schools have been asked to do a lot of things they can't do. And I think this is true in a lot of the areas that we're concerned about that have to do with safety or health or even food. So what can we do about that? How are we going to address that kind of a problem? And I think probably civic and governmental leaders, people who have positions, especially those focused on neighborhoods, are going to have to recognize that ahead, the future is going to demand that we take on 2 new roles. And I'd like to describe them. The first role is to begin to think of yourself as a precipitator. That what you're trying to do is to promote ways that local people can become more active in taking on functions that improve the neighborhood. But how can you do it without telling them what to do? Can you precipitate their acting, but not telling them how they ought to act and what they ought to act on? And the reason for that is that people will act on what it is they care about much more than what we or you care about. So the best example I know of that shows us what a precipitator could do is the assistant city manager of Savannah, Georgia. He's passed on, but the name was Henry Moore. And Henry had been using block grants to really try to improve the neighborhood. And he had to admit after a while that not much really had happened, even though he had spent a few millions of dollars. So he sat down and he wrote a one-page letter that he sent to every household in the lowest income quarter of the city. And it said, we know that you do and would like to do a lot of things to make your block better. And if you'd send me a brief letter, no more than a page long, in which you would tell me what you could do to make your block letter better, and have at least 2 other people sign it, or 1 other local association, maybe there's a block club, or maybe there's a church that will join you. Tell me what it is that you would like to do, and we have up to $100 that we could use if you needed any money, and you may not, to do what you're proposing to do. You got 82 letters from 82 different blocks. And Henry, I think, understood something that so many of us don't. He said, I got a bunch of people who say they're going to take on functions, and we're going to document and be very clear about what the functions are. But the main thing we've done is we've discovered local leaders, people on a block who want to act and can get 2 or 3 other people on that block to act with them. And so they got 82 different initiatives, and some of them dealt with youth, and some of them dealt with employment, and some of them dealt with beautification. But all of a sudden, he had precipitated local people in groups taking on new functions that had not been performed before. And then he built on that. At the end of the summer, when this was done, he had them all come to the finest hotel in Savannah, where they had a grand dinner. He had them each put up a display of what they had done. He gave awards to the ones who had done something really unusual. And then the next day, they were to stay. They stayed at the hotel. And then the next day, they met. And the question Henry had posed to him, what are we going to do next year? Can you do something that might involve more people? Can you do something that you hadn't thought you had taken on before? And in that way, without ever defining what they ought to do and how to get it done, only saying, we're the backup people, we can support you, up to $100 if you need money. We could also maybe dig some holes for trees if you needed that. But our role is to support you in doing what you want to do. And he concluded after a couple of years that he had made lasting change in the lowest income neighborhood of Savannah that never occurred when he was, as he called himself, King Henry with his large $1 million program. So that's a way of thinking about how you precipitate people. And if you begin to see that this precipitation is identifying action leadership, and you nurture that and support it, you have begun to refunction what's going on in the neighborhood. And the second function that I think we need to take on now is what I would call refunctioning. And by that, I think our research has indicated that there are 7 areas where neighbors and neighborhood organizations and associations can do things that institutions can't. And if they don't fulfill these functions that are unique to their capacity, then they won't get done, and you won't get any real change in your city or in your neighborhood. So let me remind you quickly, although you'll get a publication that goes over these in great detail, what they are. These are the functions that neighborhoods need perform if you're going to be successful, because they have to do their part beyond what institutions do. And they are health, safety, the environment, economy and jobs, food production, the raising of children, and care for the vulnerable and the marginal. So those 7 functions, if you began to think, a neighborhood is a place that produces those functions. How can we get this refunctioning done? Because everybody looks to us like we're going to do those things. And we can't. We've reached our limits. So how can we get local folks to begin to think about they're taking their part of these functions and to take it with pride? So our publications will spell this out more, but it goes a lot to what Dan has already told you. Supposing you sat at a table and had a serious discussion about those 7 functions. And the questions were, first, for the folks in the neighborhood, what is it that you can do about each of these? And second, are there some of these you could do if we gave you some backup help? And third, then there are things that we'll see that only we can do in the city. So if we have that refunctioning discussion, our question is, how can we back you up? And Dan would say, how could we get out of the way? And what can we do uniquely? A serious discussion at the table of functioning. And one of the publications that you'll get is about refunctioning and examples of that. So in summary, let me say that it is a couple things are clear. You're going to fail if neighborhoods don't take on some basic functions that have been given away to you and you can't achieve them. Every police chief knows it. Every superintendent knows it. Every public health official knows it. And you could go on down the line in terms of leadership who now know. And the way you can do that is think about yourself as a precipitator or one who is engaged in the refunctioning of city and locality. Another summary item is that we haven't discussed it. You probably aren't going to be able to achieve a lot of this if you don't have people who have ideas about how to organize communities and to produce connectors. And as Dan said, and you might look at the Abundant Community Initiative in Edmonton, where every single block in this city of 1 million people is now or will soon have a connector who is there to know what are the assets, what we can do, what functions we can take on, and is allied and networked with everybody on their own block. If you are interested in these 2 ideas of functions, precipitation and refunctioning, I be interested in convening by Zoom. Any of you who would like to pursue this whole question, this approach together. So if you are interested in having further discussion about these 2 roles in the future, drop me a line. My email is jlmabcd@aol.com. And it'll be fun to get those of you who are interested in this together and see where we can go. Turning it back to you, Rebecca.
Great, thank you for that, John. We have a number of questions in the chat that I'd like to get to. So I will just do these in the order that they appeared, and we will try to get to everyone. If we do not, we are going to be providing both John and Dan's contact information, and I'm sure they would love to have you reach out to them directly if we're not able to get to all the questions. All right, so first up, someone says, I'm interested in learning about communities who use these tools to deal with their feelings that their neighbors are the problem. For example, where many people want protection from neighbors and don't trust the police, how can this work be used?
Dan, you want?
Well, I can start with a few things, and then John, you can jump in, because that's a question that we get a lot around this. How do we start if we don't trust our neighbors? Well, you start with where you can, where there are some neighbors that you might be able, don't go to the hardest one, to sort of the hardest hill to start, but start with people that are willing to begin this journey together. And you want to grow that over time, so that people see things that are going on, see things in a different light, and then may want to join it. I kind of use the analogy of a bell curve, that on the left side of the bell curve, you got the early adopters, the folks that are ready to do this, that would love to build these relationships and do these kinds of things. At the other end, you got some folks that don't want to, for a variety of reasons. But most of the folks in the middle are just trying to get by on a daily basis. And if you can create some energy around the early adopters and what they're doing and telling stories, you over time get more and more folks to say, hey, I want to be part of that. I want to step out of my door and get to meet people and become part of the community garden or whatever other activities you're doing. So I think it's one way I like to think about it. This is a journey. We didn't get where we were in 1 year. We're not going to fix it in 1 year. So it's a journey that we need to start on. And sometimes it's going to be a meandering river that's going to flow faster than other times. John, what would you like to add?
Well, I think you're right, Dan, and in an applied sense, I think that the best way of creating more trust is to find a trustworthy person on every block, and that person we would call a connector. They are known and they are respected. And when they become involved as the stimulators of the gifts that local people have, and the sense that we have the power to produce a lot of our health and raise our children, you build out from those people. In Edmonton, where they have a person like this on every block, they hire people who've already proven themselves as good local connectors to find connectors, believe it or not. And they hire a person to find a connector on 50 blocks. And then this person becomes the conduit between the city and those 50 people. I think you've got to think about the possibility that trust exists locally in someone or someones. And the question is, how can we ally ourselves in support of them, not use them, but ally ourselves in support of them, because they believe in these people. That's why they're trusted. Becca?
Yes, thank you. All right, so I'm just going to move through these now. How effective is ABCD in highly diverse communities, specifically communities where multiple languages are spoken?
Hey, John, you can start on that one.
Well, I think it's effective when you focus on the fact that supposing you thought that the neighborhood was a place where everybody had a lot of gifts, skills, learning abilities, teaching, that it's all there and it's waiting, and we have all kinds of publications that show this, it's waiting to be mobilized, right? Now, this is true in a neighborhood where there are people of different ancestries or different races. If you look at that block, not as people who are distinctive by identities, but who are valuable as contributors, and then begin to identify what everybody has to contribute and bring them together around that idea. We find over and over again that the kinds of ideas about what separates us begins to dissolve in the face with what we can do. Our power is really amazing when we put together, and here's what we have. Dan?
No, go ahead. Next question. I think you answered that one.
All right, so this question is, could this method help a community heal after a traumatic event and or rebuild trust after events such as Katrina, Eric Brown, community policing issues, that sort of thing?
Well, the simple answer to that is yes, because the more, again, back to social capital, the more positive relationships that you can build in the neighborhood, they can then use that power to address those kinds of issues and provide some healing because of the relationships they have. So that's why we talk about the real value of relationships and positive relationships and building those.
Great. All right, and then the next one, how does an entrepreneur without title or formal power do this kind of work?
You broke up a little, Deborah. I didn't quite hear it. Can you say it again?
Yes, the question was, how does an entrepreneur without title or formal power do this work?
Is this entrepreneur a person who is in the market as an entrepreneur, or are they social entrepreneurs? There's probably a difference to that. But I think what we mean about an entrepreneur that may distinguish them from other people is that they are creating. They see a community, they see the space, they see the possibilities. And so they're always the kind of people that we want to involve. We want to get them to be connectors. It may be that somebody at the local little bakery is so well connected in the community that that person is a social entrepreneur, even though they look like they're an economic entrepreneur.
So in short, you're saying that regardless of any sort of formal title or role, anyone with that sort of social capital in their neighborhood can take on this work.
Right.
Sure, anybody can start this work, and sometimes crises bring this about. I live in Florida. We had a hurricane a couple of years ago, and our neighborhood came together to put everybody's shutters up collectively, and that began to build the impetus for some even greater things that we could do. I know we're getting close to time, so I want to tell one story that kind of brings together, I think, a couple of the questions that were asked about the role of cities and all. And I hope I don't get in trouble for mentioning the city, but when I was in Mesa, Arizona, I was the president of the United Way there. We were doing this work of helping to build neighborhoods come together. We created a partnership called Building a Healthier Mesa that had the city, the United Way, the Chamber of Commerce, and the Community Foundation, and the school district, and the community college and the school district all working together. And we built this one neighborhood we were supporting, and they decided they needed a neighborhood center for some of the activities they were doing. They were doing amazing things. They were doing their own after-school programming and summer programming for kids, with just people sharing their gifts, coming and teaching kids things. Didn't cost any money. They were just doing it. They decided they needed a location for it, a neighborhood center. They wanted it in their neighborhood. So they could have gone to City Hall and asked them to do it, or they could have marched on City Hall and said, build us the neighborhood center. But they didn't do that because we were building this on relationships. Because the city, for the most part, would use the argument, well, we can't do it for you because then we'd have to do it for everybody, so we can't do it for anybody. So what they did is they found an architect that agreed to design it for free, what they wanted. He then went to the university at ASU and got it as part of a class project, so he had it designed for free. Then they went to a contractor that they had a relationship with and asked him to use his relationships with his subs and suppliers to build it for free. He agreed to do that, to organize that. At the United Way, we said we give them a little bit of money, not for programs, but for insurance and utilities, so they could open the doors. So we had it designed, built, and opened for free, or with our relationships. We then went to the city and asked the city, we'd like you to use your gift of CDBG money to buy the land in the neighborhood where they wanted to build the center. There was a vacant lot in the neighborhood, and then lease the land back to the neighborhood for $1 a year so they could build their neighborhood center. And the city couldn't say no to that opportunity, because wouldn't it be amazing if every neighborhood was so organized that they could do those kinds of things? So literally within a year, this neighborhood had their neighborhood center by building on those relationships and those gifts that each of the institutions and the neighborhood itself had.
I think that's a really good oh, sorry, John, go ahead.
No, that's good. Want to add one other thing. We have not talked here much about associations, clubs, organizations, the informal groups that exist in neighborhoods. And they are the workforce that somebody who's a precipitator can really get involved in all kinds of activities that normally they wouldn't do. So let me commend, you're looking at our website at the abcdinstitute.org. And then if you look at publications, you'll see a lot of publications about associations. And those are very useful tools for anybody who says, I want to discover what's there in terms of local groups, because if we could get them involved as well as the individuals and a connector, we are going to have a powerful shift in who does what and who becomes a citizen rather than a client.
Great, thank you for that. I think those are both good closing comments to wrap up on. As I mentioned, that we will be sending out a follow-up email, which will be including today's slides, additional resources, and as well as the recording. The email will also include a brief survey. Please fill that out. That'll help us let us know how we did, how we might improve future webinars, and also potential ideas for future webinars. Big thank you goes out to Dan and John for taking the time and sharing your expertise with us. I've added a contact slide to the PowerPoint presentation, which will include all of our email addresses. So if there was something that wasn't quite addressed or that you're still unclear about, feel free to reach out to us using that contact information. And we really appreciate you all spending this hour of your day with us, and hope you enjoyed the call.
Thank you.